Very pleased to welcome Chris Redston, face-to-face author. Chris has been a teacher and a coursebook writer for 25 years, and he's taught in Turkey, Argentina, Italy, and the UK. He's just completed the second edition of Face-to-Face with his co-author, Julie Cunningham. So, over to you, Chris.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to you all from wherever you are in the world. Again, I see there's a huge number of different countries represented today. We have people here from Belarus and Bosnia and Italy, and from Argentina, Brazil, Belgium, Ireland, Egypt, Romania, Ecuador, Russia, Czech Republic, and it's a lot of people who are joining us from the Ukraine. So welcome to everyone and all the other countries I haven't mentioned. Thank you very much for joining me today. And today we're looking at real-world language, i.e. situational and functional language, and how best to teach these in the classroom. As you'll see on the screen, I've left you a little introductory task of some kind of simple functional language sentences, and ask you to match the sentences to the places. Here's the answers, which I'm sure you all got right, which is, which gate is it? You may ask at an airport. I'm just looking, thanks. Very useful phrase when you're in a shop. Still or sparkling, as people said on the chat box in a restaurant, asking about mineral water. Right, let me have a look at you, is what you might hear at a doctor's surgery. You're breaking up a bit on the phone if your mobile is you can't hear the person properly. Right, shall we start? A business meeting, or indeed an online webinar. Which platform at a station? And you can't miss it if people give you directions in the street. So this is a kind of language, particularly at lower levels, we're looking at what's the best way to teach. Just before we really get into it, here's a little outline of what we're going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to look at the difference between situational and functional language. Then look at the advantages of using video in class to present this kind of language. Then we'll look at some examples of situational language at lower levels. And then some ideas on good practice activities to use for this language at lower levels. Then some functional language at higher levels, followed by some tips on how to set up successful role plays, debates, and discussions using this kind of language in class. This is followed by some tips on how to deal with typical problems you might get in these kind of freer speaking activities. And finally, there'll be some time at the end for your questions. Okay, just to clarify the kind of language we're talking about today, situational language, we think of that as fixed phrases that you say or hear in a particular place, like a restaurant, a shop, an airport, a station, etc., like the ones we had in the introductory task. This is a kind of phrasebook language that students can just pick up and use, so it's very, very useful for low-level students. Usually we teach these as complete sentences or phrases, and we don't really focus on grammar. They just pick up and use chunks of language that students need in a particular situation. In terms of functional language, this is language that performs a particular linguistic function, such as apologizing, suggesting, inviting, refusing, etc. Again, we tend to teach this language as fixed chunks, or what we call sentence stems, the beginning of a sentence. And they're not taught as grammar itself. For example, in a functional language lesson, if I were you, we'd teach it as an exponent for giving advice, and not as a second conditional, although of course it is a second conditional as well. So the only grammar we tend to teach in these lessons is what comes next. For example, whether the chunk of language or the sentence stem is followed by the infinitive, third plus ing, a noun, pronoun, etc. So functional language isn't really about what the language is, it's what the language does that's important. Okay, and how do we present this kind of situational and functional language in class? Well, this type of language has always traditionally been presented in class via a listening text. You listen to someone in a shop or at the airport or in a cafe or whatever, which is how I did it for many, many years when I was teaching, because that was the only option. But now, as you may know, in face-to-face second edition, we now present this kind of functional, or as we call it, real-world language through new video clips. The action in these video clips takes place in real places in the real world. So when we were filming it, we went to a cafe in London and a shop in Manchester and a tourist information place in Cambridge, etc., etc. So we went to the real places and filmed people having the real conversation. So they're not in a TV studio, and they're not just filmed against a white screen, like you may have seen elsewhere. Also, in face-to-face, there's one real-world lesson in every unit. This means you can use video to present you language in every fourth lesson you do in the classroom. And if you can't use a video, the same conversation is always on the audio CD too. So you're not you don't have to use video, you can just use an audio CD. So now we seem to have started this trend of presenting language that is functional or situational through a video. So here's a question for you. What are the advantages of using a video clip to present situational and functional language in class instead of using an audio-only listening from a CD? If you have any thoughts on that, please just write them and send them into the chat box. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Points I think are very valid, particularly things like a lot of people have mentioned context and the visual clues that you get. And I think that's the key thing, is it really makes the language real. Students can see the context, location, and relationship between the people. So I think, as someone mentioned, the visual clues are all there. And of course, most of the language we use, we talk to people, as it were, face to face. So we can see the body language, the response, and the relationship between the people. And it also means that the meaning of situational language is instantly clear. You can see exactly what people are asking for or what they're trying to achieve. And also, they can see you speaking. One problem we have when we're writing this kind of material is if we have more than two people in a conversation, which you need sometimes. So if you've got two men or two women and it's just audio, students get confused of which guy is speaking or which woman is speaking, and it can be quite confusing. So we always have to try and find people with very different voices. Whereas if you're watching this, it makes it all very clear and easy. It also helps students with register and politeness, so they can see the relationship between the people and how polite you need to be or how informal you can be. I think a lot of people mentioned with one phrase from the chat box, it captures students' attention better. And I think that's really important, because I think students enjoy watching video and they identify with the characters. And in the book, we use the same characters throughout each level, so they get to know the characters as they work their way through the book. And also, it adds variety to lessons for the teacher. So 1 in 4 lessons they can now present through watching a video rather than listening or reading. And in the past, there's been lots of video that's been used in English language classes, but it's usually been used just for skills work, for listening practice. But we think it's really useful here to use it to present language as well as give that listening practice. And as many people have mentioned, it's more motivating for students. They like watching videos. It makes the class more entertaining and interesting for them. So there are lots of advantages of using video in class to present this kind of language. Okay, let's have a look at an example for situational language. Here's a lesson from the new Starter second edition book, which is, as you can see from the picture, is a classic in a restaurant ordering food lesson. Of course, being Starter, we need to make sure they know the vocabulary first. So the first thing we do is ask them to look at the menu and match the photos to the food and drink on the menu. Then they practice the language. So we teach the vocabulary first. And then, as you may know with face-to-face, whenever we teach vocabulary, we always want to practice it as well. So the next thing they do is a little speaking practice where they ask each other how much things are. Then we move on to the video, where Martin and Louise are at the Sunrise restaurant. We ask students to watch or listen to the conversation with the waiter. And as you'll see, you can either use the video or you can use the audio CD if you're not able to use a video in class. And here they have to tick the food and drink they order on the menu. So I'm going to play the video in a few seconds, and when you watch, imagine you're a Starter student and make a note of the food and drink that the people order. Okay, I'll just give it a few seconds to buffer wherever you are. So, what food and drink do they order? Okay, so that's the conversation, which was incidentally filmed in a restaurant here in Cambridge, and as you'll hear at the end of the conversation, what they plan to do, although what they plan to do is visit Cambridge in the story in the book, so it links with the next video. And of course, the answers were they ordered a chicken salad, a mushroom pizza, an orange juice, bottle of sparkling mineral water, apple pie, and 2 coffees. Okay, so that is presenting the language, and so the students can watch that and answer the questions, and that gives them all the visual information they need to make the language instantly clear. Then we ask them to watch or listen again and tick the customer sentences when they hear them. And this is where we use, as we use in lower levels, our flow charts, which shows what the waiter says and what the customer says. So they can listen and follow the conversation and tick the customer sentences when they hear them. So this first part is them ordering the food. The second part is them ordering dessert. And the third part is them asking for the bill. So the three sections of the conversation are broken down very clearly for the students to follow and understand. And it also gets all the target language onto the page for the teacher and student to work with. As I said before, we don't really deal with grammar very much when we teach real-world functional language. But here we do ask them to just find two questions with can I have, can we have, and would you like? So we can identify the three different sentence stems that are used in the conversation. Then, of course, they can check their answers in the language summary. Okay, after that, we move them into the practice phase of the lesson. Firstly, of course, we drill them on the language to make sure they can pronounce it. So the drills, either the teacher can run the drill themselves, or, of course, they're recorded with the correct pronunciation and intonation on the audio CD. Then we ask students to work in groups of 3 and practice a conversation that that flow chart you just see, taking turns to be the waiter or waitress. We try as much as possible to use the presentation conversation for practice, particularly at lower levels, because they really understand and have already seen the context for this conversation. Then for freer practice, we ask them to work in the same groups and write a conversation in a restaurant with 2 customers. And again, we ask them to use a language we've just focused on and food and drink from the menu. So not only do we ask them to write it, we ask them to practice it until they remember it. So they take a role each, practice until they can do it without looking. And this really helps it stick in their mind. And finally, they role play the conversation for the class. Listen to other groups and decide what they order. So that's a standard and tried and tested format for teaching the language. Present very clearly through a video, focus on the language, pronunciation, control practice, freer practice. Another way you could approach the language, this is something that's very useful to do on the board, is you could elicit each phrase or sentence that is used in the conversation one at a time. So, for example, the waiter starts with, "Are you ready to order?" The customers reply. The waiter asks about drinks. The customers give their replies. And then he asks still or sparkling about the mineral water. And the first part of the conversation finishes. So you can elicit that conversation onto the board. And then, of course, you could use that as a drill. Then one thing I often do with this is ask the students to close their eyes for a few minutes. So wherever you are in the world, unless you're kind of in a place where you shouldn't do this, just close your eyes for 5 seconds. Okay, you can open them again now. And the students open their eyes and they can see that I've rubbed out some of the words on the board. So then you ask them, say, okay, what was this sentence? What's this sentence? What's this sentence? And this is really forcing them to move the language from their short-term memory to their long-term memory. As you can see, I've rubbed out some words and just kept the first letter of things like certainly and still and sparkling. And you can continue rubbing out words until you're left with 1 word per sentence, if you like. Another thing you could do is replace the food items with little pictures of the food items, so they have to recognize the pictures as well. So I think you can work a great deal with the presentation dialogue and turn it into practice activities. And when you have this on the board, students can practice in open pairs, i.e. across the classroom, from one side to the other and everyone else listening, or in closed pairs. Or they can role play for the class. So lots of options here. And I find this rubbing out the words and getting them to remember it activity. Students enjoy it, and it also really forces them to remember the language. Okay, so to sum up some practice ideas at lower levels you can use. I think, you know, because they've seen the presentation dialogue and the video, use that as much as you can. So practice a presentation dialogue in pairs and groups, particularly at lower levels. Then you can ask students to take turns, change roles, close a book, work in new pairs, so they practice it lots of times. Then for freer practice, students can write their own conversation and then practice it themselves. And while they're doing that, of course, you can move around the room, check they've got all the language right, correct any mistakes, and help them with any problems they have. Then ask students to memorize the conversation, then role play it for the class. I never used to like students just reading the conversation from the paper because it doesn't sound natural and it doesn't really challenge them to remember the target language. Or, as I've just shown you, you can elicit the presentation dialogue onto the board, then rub out words, use first letters or pictures, and then get students to practice in open or closed pairs with the whole class, etc. Another thing that is very good to do is give them mixed up conversations. These can be on cards, so one set of cards per pair or group, or you can put on a handout. There are also quite a few examples of these in face-to-face students' book as well. Then the students put the conversation in order, then practice it. Or you can give students role cards or prompt cards and get them to practice from the card. And again, we use this technique a lot in face-to-face, and these are often in the back of the student's book. So lots of very simple but effective ways to practice functional language and situational language at lower levels. Okay, let's move on now to functional language, which we teach all the way through, but there's probably more teaching of functional language at higher levels. And here's an example from Intermediate, the Intermediate second edition. The lesson's called It's Only a Game, and the language we're teaching here is language for softening opinions, making generalizations, which is quite subtle language, but is very useful for students at this intermediate level to stop them sounding too dogmatic or opinionated when they give their opinions. And with the World Cup coming up in Brazil in a couple of months, I thought the topic of this lesson would be appropriate today, as they're talking about football. As always, the first thing we do is get the students to tune into the topic of the conversation. So they work in groups and discuss these questions. Do you know people who support a football team? About fights in football? Do they earn too much? And we always try very hard to make the questions things that students can answer whether they like the topic or like football or not. So a lot of students might have strong negative opinions of football. Then we ask them to look at the photo and then watch or listen to the conversation. Then they have to decide why Rebecca and Lisa don't like football very much. Also, you may not be able to see on your screen, but just along the bottom of the photo are the people's names. So they will know that Rebecca is the woman by the door and Lisa is the woman by the fireplace. Okay, so I'm going to play the video and watch the video and decide why don't Rebecca and Lisa like football very much. Just give a few buffering seconds. Okay, lots of very interesting comments on the chat box about that. Leticia was saying, if teachers got paid as much as footballers, ... Indeed, we only wish they did, but unfortunately that's not the case. And Barbara was commenting that she should get her husband to watch this to soften his opinions to football. And yes, indeed, it does bring out strong opinions, especially when you're losing. And I would imagine anyone in Brazil will need to watch this lesson, particularly when England beat Brazil in the final in July. Also, lots of discussion about how many people watch football without refreshments, which was quite interesting. Interesting point. We're really not supposed to put lots of cans of beer in videos for various reasons for some of the countries we sell in. So that's why. But you're quite right. I would imagine most English guys would be sitting there with a beer at least. Okay, here are the answers to the questions anyway. That Rebecca thinks football fans are really rude and aggressive, and they don't behave themselves. And she doesn't want her son growing up and becoming obsessed with football, which is obviously too late as far as the guys are concerned. And Lisa can't believe how much they get paid and why men take football so seriously. Okay, so that is the entertaining video to present the language. And then the next thing we ask people students to do is to write the correct names in these sentences. So Rebecca isn't very keen on football, etc., etc. So, and again, although you can't see it, the names are below the people in the photo, so they'll know the names of the people. Then we ask them to watch again and check their answers. So by now, they have watched the video twice. And then we move on to the language, which takes out key sentences from the video. And this is the kind of language we're teaching. Things like some of them can be quite aggressive at times. And on the whole, generally speaking, footballers tend to earn rather a lot of money. So these phrases in bold that soften your opinions, so people don't sound rude or offensive. And very useful language to teach intermediate students, so they don't sound too dogmatic when they speak in English. So we focus on the language there. Then we do a little bit of focus on the grammar attached to the language. So tend to takes the infinitive. And whether really, quite, not very, and a bit come before or after the adjective. And generally speaking, and on the whole at the beginning of the sentence. So just a little bit on the grammar of the language. And then we get the students to listen and practice to the sentences. So they practice pronouncing the sentences with the correct stress and intonation. So we presented the language, checked a bit of grammar, and done the pronunciation. Then we move on to some practice. Firstly, some control practice, where they have to make complete sentences using the words in brackets. These are opinions about children, another topic that can raise strong opinions. Children don't do enough sport. On the whole, most children don't do enough sport. They're very stubborn. Perhaps children tend to be a bit stubborn, etc. So they have to make softer phrases using the language. Then they compare sentences and decide if they agree with the sentences. So, as always, again in face-to-face, we try and make any control practice activity turn into an interesting personalized speaking activity, as we looked at in previous webinars. Then we get students to work on their own. It's very important they do this on their own first and think of reasons why they tend to agree or disagree with these sentences. Men watch too much sport. Men are better at sport than women. Teenagers are lazy and sleep too much. Again, as they sound, very dogmatic sentences. So decide how they can use the language to soften your opinions. So they do preparation of ideas and language on their own. Then they work in groups, discuss the sentences, and obviously using the target language and have a discussion about these topics, which can cause quite a lot of discussion in class, particularly sentence 6, maybe. Students always cheat in exams. Students have strong opinions about that too, I seem to remember. Then they tell the class which sentences they agreed or disagreed with. So we move from the clear presentation video through the language into controls and then freer speaking practice. Okay, here's another example of another lesson using the same characters. This is called What the Matter and looks at language for showing concern, giving advice and responding to advice. Again, we start with some questions to get students tuned into the topic. Questions like what types of problem do people often ask for advice about? Who was the last person who asked for advice? When did you last give someone advice? So just getting them into the topic of problems, giving and asking for advice. Then we ask them to work in pairs and look at the photos and see what they remember about Lisa, Rebecca and Charlie, who they have already met. So they might remember Rebecca and Charlie are married, they have a son called Harry, Lisa's their next door neighbour, etc., etc. So this again really helps students to connect to characters they've seen in previous lessons. Then we ask them to watch or listen to 2 conversations. And they have to decide what problems do Rebecca and Charlie talk about. Okay, so I'm going to show you this video now. So watch the video. What problems do Rebecca and Charlie talk about? Okay, just to pick up one question on the chat box that Mary Ward asked about the audio and the video is, yes, the audio on the audio CD is exactly the same as the video. It's the soundtrack from the video. So it's not different actors or anything. It's exactly the same soundtrack as the video, just obviously without the pictures. Okay, the answers, of course, are Rebecca and Charlie's son Harry isn't sleeping very well, so they wake up a lot in the night. I'm sure anyone with young children would identify with that problem. And as Leticia said, maybe they should hire a nanny. Charlie is always very tired when he goes to work the next day. And he gets home, he's exhausted and fed up. They're having lots of arguments, often about how much Rebecca is spending on the house and the children. So you would check the answers with the class. And then the second activity, we ask students to work in the same pairs and decide if these sentences are true or false. So see what they can remember from the conversations. So they work through this together. The baby wakes up 2 or 3 times. Is that true or false? Then they watch again and check their answers. And then they compare answers and correct the false sentences together. So there's very clear context for the target language. Then in the real world box, we pick out the bits of language which are the functional language for the lesson. So the first set, and they have to decide which sections of language give advice, respond to advice, and show concern. So the showing concern phrases like, oh dear, what's the matter? And the giving advice, have you tried talking to him about it? Then the responding to advice, yes, you could be, you're right. Well, it's worth a try, I guess, etc. So picking out very natural language that you'd use for giving and responding to advice. And incidentally, the language that we use in these are all been heavily researched in the Cambridge International Corpus, where we can look through millions, if not billions, of words of English to check what kind of language people use in these situations in real life. Okay, and then we do a little bit about the grammar and look at fill in the gaps with I should or should I. So the difference between what should I do and what do you think I should do. Then moving on to the practice, we have, first we have a help with listening activity where they listen to decide if people sound concerned or not. So they listen to the same sentences said twice, and who sounds more concerned, A or B? Etc. So they listen to decide which ones are more concerned. And that really highlights that the change in pitch of the voice is what makes you sound concerned. Having taught students that, we can then drill the language where they copy the stress and intonation, and then move on to practice. Here they have to write 2 conversations using these prompts. This is what we, Gilly and I, always call dehydrated sentences, like what matter becomes what's the matter. Sorry, hear that becomes I'm sorry to hear that, etc. So another very good way of practicing language in a controlled way and getting students to focus on all the little words. And again, they practice the conversations with their partner at the end. Then we get students to do a role play. So we ask them to go to the back of the book and look at 3 different pages where they each have a particular problem they need to discuss. I'm just going to look at one of the problems today. This is student A's problem, where they have to imagine they have this problem. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read it. Okay, so the student has to understand the problem and think of one thing they've tried to do to solve the problem. So a bit of time on their own to get their head around the problem and what kind of solutions there could be. Then they work with students from the other groups and take turn to explain their problems, show concern, and give advice. So, I've got a bit of a problem. Oh dear, what's the matter? Well, my cousin got divorced recently and he's staying at our house, etc. One little tip on this, I always get students to close their book when they're doing the speaking, because it's much better if they explain the problem in their own words, not just read it from the box in the book, because that makes it sound like it's really their problem. They're not just reading it off the page. Then they tell the class the best piece of advice they've received. So role play and also discussions and debates are a very good way to practice functional language. And here are a few tips on running role plays and debates and discussions. Okay, I think it's very important that students work on their own first so they can prepare the ideas and language they need for a speaking activity. If you just throw people in cold, they're much less likely to be able to do the activity successfully. Alternatively, you can get students to work in same role pairs to gather their ideas. So, for example, you could get two people who have cousins sleeping on their sofa to discuss their ideas together and then separate them for the group stage. While they're doing this, your job is to monitor and help students with ideas and language. And I'd always suggest you go to the weaker students first to check they know what they're doing and they're okay with what they have to do. Also, plan in advance how to organize a class and who works with who. I always set a time limit when they start, like, okay, you've got 5 minutes or 10 minutes. I find it really helps students pace their conversation. If they know they got 10 minutes, they can settle into a longer conversation. If they know they got 3 minutes, they have to get to the point straight away. Of course, you can bend the time limit as you go, depending on how it goes, but I think it's a useful thing to do. While they're working, the first thing you need to do is go around each parent group and check they're all doing it right. So many times when I was teacher training, I'd see the teacher not realize that one or two groups were doing it all wrong until right at the end of the activity. So just check they're all doing it correctly. Then you can help students with problems and correct mistakes in the target language. Even though it's a free speaking activity, I would always correct mistakes in the language you're teaching in the lesson. After all, that's the whole point of the lesson. And if they make mistakes now, they're not going to get any better. This could include intonation errors as well, if they're not sounding interested or concerned. And finish by doing a feedback stage with each para group, telling the class their conclusions. Okay, now just going to look at some of the problems that can happen during role plays or debates or discussions. One problem that often comes up is sometimes there are the wrong number of students. You need groups of 3, and you never have 18 students in the class. You always have 17 or 22 or whatever. It never works out right, does it? So that's the problem. The wrong number of students. I think a key thing is to plan who you're going to put with who early on in the lesson. So I do your classroom maths, and a good time to do this is while they're watching the video. You've seen the video, you know the answers, so it gives you 3 minutes to decide, okay, I'll put that student with this student, okay, we need a group of 4 here, 3 here, etc. So plan your classroom maths while they're watching the video. If you've got 1 or 2 students too few, have a couple of smaller groups, and you can give strong students 2 roles. Or you could leave out a role in 1 or 2 of the groups. So, for example, in the one we looked at, you could sometimes just have a pair where they have 1 problem each, and the 3rd problem you don't worry about. Or if there's 1 or 2 students too many, you can put 2 weaker students together to be 1 character. And maybe they can take turns to say the sentences. Or if you can, invent some new roles, for example, a husband or wife, a colleague, that fit with the situation, and give them to the extra students. So again, for example, the person who has their cousin sleeping on their sofa, you could have a husband and wife both complaining about that and deciding what to do. One thing I really advise is avoid taking roles yourself if you're short of students, because that means you can't help the other students at all. You're locked in with one pair or group of students. And although those students would benefit greatly, the rest of the students need you if they have a problem or they're not understanding. So try not to take roles yourself. Try and find another way to solve the problem with the wrong number of students. Okay, another problem that often happens is students aren't using the target language. You spent all lesson presenting this language and the students aren't using it in the free speaking activity. Here's one idea I use a lot to make sure they use the language. You can write all the exponents or the target language on separate cards. Give 4 or 5 cards to each person, then tell them they have to use the language on their cards in the conversation. After they use each card, they throw it on the table or on the floor. They just get rid of it. And they have to try and get rid of all their cards before the end of the conversation. So this makes it into a bit of a game, so they have to get rid of the language they're holding in their hands. So this really forces them to use a target language. Alternatively, if you haven't got time to make lots of cards, you can ask students to tick the exponents in the real world box or in the language summary when they use them. So when they use an exponent, they can just tick it. Okay, I've used that one, I've used that one, I've used that one. Also, you can write them on the board and they kind of mentally tick them as they use it. So force them to use a target language. That's the point of the practice. Another problem, of course, is some pairs or groups finish too early. So here are some things you can do to deal with that. Again, perhaps when you're watching the video or before you go into the lesson, think of a follow-up task to keep them talking. For example, with the one we looked at, what's the best way to tell your cousin to move out? How can you go about that? You could ask pairs or groups to plan how they're going to report their results of their discussion or debate to the class during feedback. So, okay, they've finished the discussion. Just say, okay, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to tell the class about what you discussed, and they have to plan what they're going to report. They can make notes on this as well. And if you've got 2 or 3 pairs or groups that finish early, ask students to report their conversation to a new partner. So if you're in pairs, for example, you've got AA, BB, BCC, you can mix them up, and they report their conversation to a new partner. This is a very effective way if people finish early. Just get them to tell someone else what they've been talking about. And also, if you've got a few pairs finishing, give the rest of the class a time limit to hurry them up. Say, okay, you've got 2 more minutes, try and come to a conclusion, or whatever. And don't feel you need to wait till every single group has finished before doing feedback. And finally, in a debate, some students tend to dominate and others aren't speaking at all. This often happens, particularly in a more formal debate. One way to get around that is make a confident or dominating student, we all know who they are, the chairperson. I find that if you can tell him or her that he or she must make sure everyone speaks in turn, they usually enjoy the responsibility and it really forces them to do turn taking. So in a strange way, by making them in charge of the conversation, it makes them speak less and allows other people to speak more. You could also prepare a prompt card for the chairperson with phrases they can use, like, what's your opinion on that? Or can you comment on that? To help them bring other people into the conversation. And make sure weaker students have enough points to talk about when you're doing the preparation, so they're not left behind. Okay, so just to finish up, how can we help students with functional or situational language? I think it's important to present the language using realistic video material as we've been looking at from face-to-face today, to establish the context and increase students' motivation. We need to teach the language in chunks, not teach it as grammar, and provide clear models of polite intonation. Also, try and provide meaningful speaking practice through personalized speaking, role play, and group discussions. And try and anticipate problems with speaking activities and plan how to avoid them. And if we manage to do all that, hopefully we can really help students with real-world functional and situational language. Okay, that's the end of today's talk, but just before I throw it open to questions, I just want to point out for those using face-to-face where the real-world videos are. They're on the teacher's DVD, which is in the back of the teacher's book. That includes all the real-world videos, and that's where you'll find them. And as I say, the same conversations, exactly the same conversations are on the audio CD too. Okay, my next talk is in a month's time, well, 4 weeks' time today, on Tuesday, May the 6th, again at 3 o'clock UK time, and that is called Work It Out For Yourself, which is about helping students with grammar. So I look forward to seeing you all then. So that's in 4 weeks' time. Okay, I don't know if there have been any questions coming in.
We have had a few, so we've only got a few minutes, unfortunately, so we may be able to ask all of them.
Excuse me.
But we had a question from Isabel Gonzalez Bueno at the beginning, and she asked, is the idea to teach this language as chunks, as in the lexical approach?
Yes, I guess it is part of the lexical approach, and I think traditionally this kind of real-world language, language you use in particular situation, has always been taught in terms of chunks. I mean, obviously the lexical approach goes further than this and tends to teach, if you take it to its logical conclusion, it teaches all language in terms of lexical chunks. Whereas we in face-to-face kind of look at grammar as grammar, vocabulary as vocabulary. But I'd agree, yes, this is a lexical approach to this kind of language.
Okay, thanks, Chris. A couple of questions on a similar theme. Have you ever had a situation where you've had a whole class refuse to do role plays, for example, and how would you deal with that? So that was from Mary Ward, and somebody else asked as well, Snezana asked, what to do if students refuse to speak at all? Have you ever encountered issues like that?
Interesting one. I've never had a whole class refuse to do role plays. I'm not sure what I'd do with that. Maybe I'd just move them down to the lower level and that would teach them. But I guess if you have a group of students who refuse to do role plays, you would need to find another way to do freer speaking practice in the class. And it may be culturally there are issues with doing role plays, and I know from in some cultures they kind of expect all their speaking to be to the teacher, not to each other. So that's something that can sometimes cause problems. I think if that does happen, or if you have people who don't want to do it, you need to maybe have a discussion with them about why not, and also to give them your reasons, your pedagogical reasons, why you think this is a good idea. For example, if 25 students are all speaking at the same time, they all get practice. If one student's talking to you, only one gets practice. But I think, you know, if they all refuse to do it, then maybe you have to find different ways to do it. One way you could motivate them, or it might help, is if you turned it a bit more into a performance and suggested you videoed them. And if they felt they were doing making a video that they could either put online or you could use in class, that might motivate them to get into it a bit more.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Those are pretty useful suggestions there. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today, but we have got a lot of other events coming up. As Chris mentioned, he's got his next one coming up on the 6th of May. And just to mention that on April the 15th, we've got Jan McCartan, who's coming back to do a talk on the subject of what good teaching materials should do looking at grammar. So if you go to the Cambridge News and Events page, which I'll post in the chat box in a second, you can find out more about those events. But thanks again to Chris for today's very interesting session, and we will look forward to welcoming you all to the next face-to-face webinar. So thanks again, Chris.
Okay, thank you all for joining me today. Have nice holidays, if holidays are coming up soon, and I'll see you again in 4 weeks. Bye.